Okay, so believe it or not, after all the factoring that you've done and the completing the square that you've done, there is still yet another way to do it. So this is like the, if you can't do any of the other ways, this is what you do method. Yes, there is a formula to figure all this out, and it's called the quadratic formula. It helps us to solve a quadratic equation. As you can see back here, I also have my calculator handy. You're going to want to take your calculator out as well. Later on in the lesson, we're going to talk about using the calculator to get an answer to maybe the nearest tenth or the nearest hundredth. So here we go. So when we solve the quadratic formula, we first have to have it written in this form here, where we set it equal to 0. A, B, and C are going to be the numbers that are in front of the different variables. A is the coefficient of x squared, B is the coefficient of x, and C is the number at the end. So you have this big old crazy formula here. And yes, I'm going to do you a solid, because the way you remember it is you sing Pop Goes the Weasel. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I got to give props to Mr. Baker for that one. So when you see Mr. Baker, tell him that Mr. Mahoney sang the song. And the way that I also like to consider this is I like to put parentheses around my values. So that's another way that I kind of like to write it. So let me show you what I mean. So when I go to solve this by the quadratic formula, before I even get there, remember how when we did the completing the square, we got a positive and a negative answer? Let me hop back for a second. See that plus or minus in the middle? Same idea, it's the two different answers. So do you want to separate the fractions? You can always do that if you want to. This is what the two answers will look like. So enough with the chit chat, let's go do some quadratic formula. So if you take a look at this expression here, this equation here, I have it set equal to 0. So in my quadratic formula, A is going to equal 2, B is going to equal negative 7, and C is going to equal 6. So I go to my formula and I plug those numbers in. Let's see, x equals negative b, which is negative 7, plus or minus the big old square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, we're kind of done. I mean, we just have to evaluate and simplify a couple things. So the negative of negative 7 is 7. I get a square root here. On the bottom, 2 times 2 is 4. And here's one thing that I found to be helpful, is that if I go to my calculator now and I type in what's underneath my radical sign, if I go to my calculator for a minute and I type in parentheses, negative 7 squared, subtract 4 times 2 times 6, and I press enter, that's what my value is underneath my radical sign. Turned out to be 1. So what I get here is 7 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 4. Now, I know what the square root of 1 is. This is great. So I can write it as x equals 7 plus or minus 1 over 4. And yeah, there is 2 answers here. So one of my answers is 7 plus 1 over 4. 7 plus 1 is 8. Divided by 4 is 2. So one of my answers is that x equals 2. My other answer is found by doing 7 minus 1 over 4, which is 6 over 4. If you want to reduce the fraction to 3 over 2, you could do that. So if you wanted to get crazy and do that solution set and write it as 2 comma 3 over 2, you could do that. And again, have you seen the answers that look like that before? When we completed the square, sometimes our answers they kind of looked like that. So that's how we really use our quadratic formula. Let's try another one, because I'm going to make this one hard for you. So this is why it's a hard problem. It's not set equal to 0. So do you think you could set it equal to 0? That would be great. So if I subtract 4 from both sides, I'm going to get 3x squared plus 5x minus 4 equals 0. So then I know that my a value is 3, my b value is 5, and my c value is negative 4. And I plug those numbers in and I go. So let's see what we get. Here's my square root. 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 4. All over 2 times 3. So again, you want to simplify what's underneath the radical sign? Let's type it in just as we see it into the calculator. So now I have the square of 5 minus 4 times my a value times my c value. C was negative 4. So now I get 73. Not a big deal. So then my equation, I'm just going to simplify down to, let's see, the negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 73 all over 6. Perfect. We could leave it like that if we wanted to. But let's do this. Let's go a little bit further. Because remember that there are two answers. One of them is x equals 5 plus the square root of 73 over 6. And the other one is x equals 5 minus the square root of 73 over 6. Whoops, you are correct. They're negative 5s. Good catch. Now, let's go one step further with the calculator. Let's say I want to take these two answers here. Let's say I want to take this answer right here and this answer right here. And I want to find them to the nearest tenth. So let me go to my calculator. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to type in that fraction. Remember, we do control division first to get the fraction template. And then my numerator is going to be negative 5 plus, whoops, I hit times, plus the square root. So square root is control and then x squared. And then I'm going to go to the bottom and divide by 6. I'm going to type it in like that. I'm going to press enter. And it's going to give me my value. Let's go to the nearest hundredth because it looks really pretty to the nearest hundredth. Let's go negative or 0.59 as our answer. So the positive answer, if we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, is 0.59. Now I know what you're saying. I got to retype everything. Oh. No, you don't. Check this out. If I press my up arrow until that expression is highlighted, I can press Control, Enter. Try that again. Let's press Control, Enter. And then we get the expression at the bottom. Now, what I want to do, though, with this is I want to go and change the positive sign to a subtraction sign. Not a negative, but I'm going to do 5 minus the square root of 73. Let's hit that decimal. So if I round this next one to the nearest hundredth, it looks like negative 2.26. The 5 is in the hundredth spot. The 7 is greater than 5, so it's going to round that number up to negative 2.26. So that's using the quadratic formula to get our answers. We can use factoring, we can use completing the square, but the quadratic formula will always work. So what I'd like you to do now, so perhaps you're wondering, hey, where does this formula come from? Who just invented it? You know, I'm really big on, let me show you where the formula comes from. I like you to see where things happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to complete the square to the general form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. I'm going to complete the square with all my letters. So the first thing that I realize is that my coefficient of x squared isn't 1. It's some value a. Now a might be 1, but there's a good chance it's not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything by a. And yeah, I'm really going to divide 0 by a also, but that equals 0. So then what I get is x squared plus b over a times x plus c over a equals 0. Now, what you probably remember that we have to do is we have to complete the square. So I got to get rid of this c over a. Let me subtract it over to the other side. And I get x squared plus b over a times x. And I'm going to leave a blank space, baby, and I'll write your name. And I got another blank space, baby, and I'll write your name. And I know you're saying, whoa, why'd you put the blank space on the left? I'm going to show you why in a second. Things are going to work out nicely for us. So now what we got to do is we got to figure out the number that goes in that blank space. And if you remember, what you used to do was you took the coefficient of the x, the quote middle number, and you divided it by 2. You didn't put in parentheses yet. You took that middle number and you divided it by 2, and then you squared it. So that looks pretty ugly. We got to simplify that a little bit. What you might remember way back from your middle school days is that if we actually wrote it like this, you might do the old Putnam Valley theme song, which was the first one stays the same, the sign changes its name. So we get b over a times. You flip the next one upside down, and then you play the game. So that's going to give me b over 2a. And that's what I can square. Let me square that thing now. Because then I square the top, and I get b squared. And I square the bottom, and I get 4a squared. Let me go to my next page for a second. I'm going to remember that this b squared minus 4a squared, this thing here is what I'm putting in my blank space, baby. So here we go. Let me write your name. So then what I have is x squared plus b over a times x plus, here's that thing I'm putting in my new c value. And remember, I put the blank space on the left side. I did it because I want the b squared over 4a squared minus c over a. So now let's play a little bit. First, the left side. On the left side, it's a perfect square trinomial. So what you might remember is you can take half of the middle or the square root of the term of that new c value. So I'm going to take the square root of that new value. The square root of b squared is b. The square root of 4a squared is 2a. So that's what the left side simplifies to when I factor it. Now, my right side, we got to play with it for a minute. Let's take out the green marker. Because I need a common denominator. So what am I going to multiply the a by to give me 4a squared? Well, it needs a 4a. So the top needs a 4a also. So when I do that, what I get now is b squared over 4a squared. But I have a common denominator, right? That gives me my 4ac. Now, let's just solve it using square roots. When we take the square root of both sides, we get x plus b over 2a. Now help me on the other side. When I take the square root, I'll take the square root on this side here too. So when I take the square root over here, the numerator stays kind of ugly. So it's going to stay as plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. There's not much I can do with that. But the denominator, you can take the square root. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of a squared is a. And lo and behold, common denominators. Oh, we love it. And then all we got to do is subtract b over 2a. So when we do that, check out what we get. We get negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's our quadratic formula. Pretty nifty, huh? So the quadratic formula really comes from completing the square. How cool is that, man?